Welcome back to Understanding Islam, the Big Picture. This is our monthly question and answer session when I look at and talk about some of the questions that people have sent in by email. So we'll get started with the first question here. Prophet Muhammad paired each person from Medina with one from Mecca, and yet he paired himself with Ali. Why did he do this? Well, we can look at this in two perspectives. First of all, we know that the Prophet is very keen on not showing favoritism. We have the example of when the Prophet arrived in Medina, lots of people were saying, "Come and stay with me, come and stay with me." And instead, he allowed his camel to wander freely until it came to a natural stop, and that was the place where he settled. So he is very keen not to be showing favoritism, and we could imagine that there were lots of people in Medina saying, "Pair with me, pair with me." From another perspective, we have the tradition that the Prophet regarded Ali as his brother. He said that you are my brother and you are the one with whom I will pair. So he pairs with Ali because of the special relationship between the two of them. Let's take another question. We're asked then about Abu Talib. He is the uncle of Prophet Muhammad. Was he a Muslim? He protected the Prophet, and how can somebody protect somebody if they do not believe in them? Well, the reality is that on this question, like others, the sources are unclear. There are some sources that speak of Abu Talib as being a Muslim, and there are others that speak of him as not acknowledging the prophethood of Muhammad, not making his shahada, and not being a Muslim. And there are just these two different positions within the traditions themselves. I'm not able to tell you which of those two is correct. Let's take another question. If Islam treats all human beings the same, why did Muslims in the time of the Prophet have slaves? This question of slavery is a really useful one because it brings out several points. First of all, it reminds us that a principal way of changing human conduct is to appeal to our better nature, to appeal to our higher selves. And so we have the moral exhortation for people to do a good act, to buy a slave and set them free. And we know, for example, that Abu Bakr was well known for buying and freeing slaves. We know also that the Prophet freed his own slave. It enables us to see another principle too, and that is the principle of the gradual reform of society. It is true that in that society people continued to have slaves even though there was a moral exhortation from the Prophet to stop the practice. And yet there is a gradual reform, as we see on the question of alcohol. Stage by stage, moving people toward the higher ideal of treating all human beings freely and equally. We have a third point to take from this, and we need to be very honest and say that throughout history, in Islam, as in all other religious traditions, not every Muslim has lived according to the high ideals and teachings of the faith. And we know that there was a long history of Arab Muslims being involved in slave trading along the coast of East Africa. and we would have to say that that was an example of people not living to the highest ideals of the teaching of the Prophet. Let's take another question. This is an easy question. Is there anywhere in history that says that Prophet Muhammad sold alcohol or traded in alcohol even before the time of Islam? The answer is no. I've certainly never read anything, and I've never met anybody who has. So I think that to the extent of my knowledge, certainly we can give a simple answer: no. The Prophet never traded in alcohol and never used alcohol in any way. Here is a more complex question. What religion was Muhammad before the time of Islam? How can the father of Muhammad be called Abdullah, the servant of God, before Islam had come? Were the family of Muhammad Christians before they were Muslims? Well, we have three different parts to that question. Again, the first one is easy to answer. Were the family of Muhammad Christians before they were Muslims? No. We have no evidence of that. Nothing that I have ever seen would indicate that that was the case. And then we have the case of the Prophet's father, who is called Abdullah. Abdullah, of course, means the servant of Allah, the servant of God. Now, there are two ways of understanding this. We are told that the Prophet himself and his family come from the community of the Hanif. They are the people who believe in one God only, and they are seeking knowledge about God. In that way, it would make sense that the Prophet's father is called Abdullah, the servant of that one God. He is a Hanif. He is seeking that knowledge. It's also important that we see the use of the word Allah in another way in pre-Islamic Arab society, because it seems as though the Arabs had an understanding of what we can think of as a pyramid of gods: family gods, clan gods, tribal gods, and then one supreme God, as it were, sitting on the top of the pyramid. Now, this is not the way that Islam understands it. Islam does not say that God is the supreme God, bigger and better than all the others. No. What Islam is saying is that God is the only God. There is nothing else worthy of worship except God. So it's possible that we could meet the term Allah before the time of Prophet Muhammad in that pre-Islamic Arabian society, where its meaning is not an Islamic one, but really it's saying, this is the biggest God of our system. Now, this, of course, is a reflection, perhaps, of the way in which that community still remembered the teaching of Abraham and Ishmael amongst them. The crucial point here is that Prophet Muhammad himself comes from this community of the Hanif. His family belonged to that community, and really they are saying that they are the inheritors of the tradition of the worship of God alone, which was begun in Mecca and in the Arabian Peninsula by Abraham and by Ishmael, and those prophets establish a practice of the belief in one God only. The Hanif inherit that belief, and therefore that is the family from which the Prophet himself comes. Let's take another question. This question is about human beings' need for guidance. How can it be that all human beings need guidance? We have brains. Can't we work it out for ourselves? Why do we need guidance? A lot of people are living their life without God, and they seem to live a normal life. The reality is, as we're all aware, that not all human beings are endowed with the same qualities of intellect. Not all of us have the same ability to think, to reason, and to ponder things out. Some people need guidance from others. They need examples that they can follow. They are not in a position to come to that inner certainty with their own use of reason. Secondly, sometimes human beings can become so clouded by the society in which they live that it becomes very difficult for them to rise to the heights of that intellectual freedom to be able to work things out for themselves. In other words, they need a certain discipline and training so that one can come to an inner disposition to be able to grasp the truths of the religion. We can think of that in our own society, a society which is based on provoking need in people through advertising, so that you are actually manipulating people so that they feel the need to go out and buy whatever the goods are that you're advertising. Now, with that kind of psychological manipulation, you can see that you are, as it were, playing with people's intellectual ability to make a free decision for themselves. In that way, it is a blessing from God to send guidance and prophets to humankind, to show them how life can be lived, and as it were, to break through that cloudiness and uncertainty of the society in which they live. Finally, we can think of the Quran as being a great mercy and a great blessing from God, because it comes down as guidance into the human condition for all human beings and for all times from that time onwards, protected by God from change, and therefore it is, as it were, a cure for the illness of humankind. It is a cure for human forgetfulness, for human waywardness, and it supports and underpins the weakness of the intellect of many people amongst us. So we are to use our reason, we are to use our God-given abilities to think and ponder things out and come to a clarity of understanding upon which faith can build. But human beings also, in Islamic understanding, need the mercy and the generosity of God in sending prophets to humankind to show them the way, to give them guidance, to lay down a spiritual practice, a practical way of living, and also the blessing and the mercy of a book of Revelation sent by God. Let's take another question. Why was Prophet Muhammad respected from the Quraysh before he was a prophet, and they trusted him, but after he became a prophet, they accused him of lying? This indeed is a true report of the situation. We know that in his early life, before the call to prophethood, before the first revelation of the Quran, Prophet Muhammad himself was recognized by his own community as being a wise person, a trustworthy person, a truthful person. We have the example of people coming to him to seek guidance, to seek arbitration, as we would say today, and of him helping to solve the problems of people in that community. We have the example of the rebuilding of the Kaaba, in which the black stone, which is in the corner of the Kaaba, had been taken out during the rebuilding works, and there was a discussion as to who should be the one to have the honor to replace it. And the Prophet solves it by a very practical piece of peacemaking, of arbitration. They call upon his help, he gets them to lay down a blanket, and then he puts the stone in the middle of the blanket, and the elders of all the clans of Mecca help to carry the stone back into place and to put it there where it belongs, and he actually rolls it into place. So they clearly had a trust of him before the time of his call to prophecy, before the first revelation. Even after the time of the revelation, we know that between the years 610 and 622, when he left Mecca and migrated to Medina, still even his enemies trusted him. We know that when he left Mecca to make his hijrah or migration to Medina, he had in his possession several items which had been entrusted to his safekeeping by people that were not Muslims, by some of them who were his enemies within the community. But even so, they trusted his uprightness, his integrity, his truthfulness. And we know that he left behind him, when he migrated, Ali, his son-in-law, and his cousin. And he said to Ali, "You are responsible for seeing that each one of these pledges is returned to its rightful owner. And only after you have done that can you migrate and come and join us in Medina." So even after the time of the beginning of Islam and the call to prophethood, do we then see that they also were trusting him. And yet the reality was that a lot of the people of the Quraysh opposed not just the person of the Prophet, but most especially his message. And I think that the best way of understanding that is they opposed him because he threatened their established way of life, which was lucrative for them, which enabled them to exploit people, and which was the basis of their trade. Because the first messages that the Prophet was sharing with the people of Medina was the worship of idols is meaningless, it has no value at all, worship God alone, be honest and just and truthful in all your dealings. Now, these two messages were not something that the merchants of the Quraysh, the merchants of Mecca, wanted to hear, because they were afraid if people stopped worshipping the many gods that were around in Mecca at the time, that would stop the pilgrimage, that would stop the trade, that would stop people coming to buy goods from them. And no merchant wants to be told, be honest and faithful and trust in all your dealings. So I think that the opposition to Muhammad and to the message in this early period is really, it hit them in their trading balance. It was going to destabilize their way of life. He was challenging their traditions, the way that they did things. We know, for example, that in that community, the way that they dealt with too many girl babies was that they would kill some of them. And he stops those kind of practices with a very firm word. And those are the reasons, I think, why he was opposed, even though they personally continued to trust him. Moving on now, we have a comment here, not really a question, a comment which reminds us that those who hold fast to the rope of God, will have no complaint against God's justice and God's mercy, but they can be assured of the mercy and forgiveness of God, which is a very helpful message for us constantly to be reminded of. And now finally, I want to turn to a question here which takes a good point, but also has a degree of misunderstanding of something that I said in an earlier talk. It is about the first male Muslims, the first believers, the first to acknowledge the prophethood of Muhammad. And we need to distinguish here between different things. We have the episode in which the prophet is told to pass the message to the members of his family. And he gathers together, he calls, if you like, a family gathering, and he puts to them the message that he has been called by God to be a messenger of God, and he invites them to belief. And we know that the person who steps forward and becomes the first of his family to believe, the first male of his family to believe, is Ali, his cousin, who is at this time a young boy, perhaps of 10 years of age. And so in this family gathering, it is clear it is only the members of the family who are present, and Ali it is who takes the initiative and steps forward to believe. The first believer is generally acknowledged amongst Muslim communities to be Khadija, who is the wife of the Prophet. So then Ali steps forward as the first male member of the family. There are other people who also are very early as Muslims, as followers in the faith. And amongst these are Abu Bakr and Uthman. We have a piece of witness from Ibn Ishaq, who writes the first biography of the Prophet, and he speaks of four men who were the first to believe. And he lists Ali and Abu Bakr, Zayd ibn Haritha, and Uthman. So these are listed by Ibn Ishaq as being the first male believers. And of course, Abu Bakr, Uthman, and Ali are early leaders of the Muslim community. It's important that we distinguish these two elements. Our writer here also makes mention of Umar. Just to say, first of all, remember that Uthman has the distinction of being one who migrates twice. He is the first to migrate to Abyssinia, and he then also migrates to Medina. Now, the migration to Abyssinia is taking place in 615, so that's important. And finally, just to say a word about Umar, the second caliph in the Sunni tradition. Umar is quite a delayed convert. He doesn't convert for a few years after the time of Muhammad, and indeed he is an opponent of the early Muslim community. But there is a nice story which is told of his conversion. And Umar is the kind of person who is not slow to make his feelings felt. And he hears his sister and her husband reciting verses from the Quran in the house. He bursts in, he asks to be shown this document. And they say, no, you're not fit to handle it. You don't have the ritual washing. And eventually, anyway, he is given this small piece of the Quran. It is from Surah 20, the Surah Taha. And when he reads it, this is the moment that faith enters his heart, and he becomes a Muslim. And then he goes off and pledges his faith makes his shahada before the Prophet himself. So these are amongst the early Muslim community. That's all we have time for this week with our questions and answers. Please feel very free to send in by email questions for the next question and answer session. I look forward to seeing you then, and I look forward to being with you again for Understanding Islam at the same time next week.